Jake, you and I are here at the do or die moments of this competition. We are now looking at players who are in a win-and-in situation. And again, we have been able to bring some of the coolest matches all day. And we have another really great one with Alberto, Lara, and Toler, Webb. But Jake, we have a lot of numbers to go through. Are getting into their first match here. It is the Great Tusk and the Talonflame for Toler, Webb. And Alberto is leading the Klefki and the Corviknight. We are seeing him right away.
Yes, the Corviknight poised pretty well into that Great Tusk. That is one of the premier counters to Great Tusk that you're going to see in this metagame. Klefki doesn't love seeing Great Tusk, but it looks like he's going straight for that Terra Ghost, which I think is smart. Like, you can't get trapped in that Shadow Tag. You're going to resist you're going to be immune to that close combat and not take super effective damage from something like a Headlong Rush. Talonflame Great Tusk on Alberto's end, that was very much like the flavor of the week heading into Orlando. Talon Tusk was something that everyone started using, everyone was scared of. I personally was terrified of playing against it. And so it's a very solid lead. You have the option for Priority Tailwind, you have the option for a lot of damage up front from that Great Tusk.
Yeah, already with a Terastallization here, that is going to start putting out some big defensive pressure, actually. Like you said, this Terra Ghost on the Klefki does really help it out in the face of those Pokemon on the opposite side. Also, not taking something like, you know, for like super effective damage from that Talonflame is huge. I mean, typically they don't run any sort of Flare Blitz like I wish they did, you know. Reflect going up this turn, Will-O-Wisp going on to the Corviknight, a great way to start kind of shutting down this Pokemon early in the game before it can do too much damage. Corviknight not gonna love having that burn. Headlong Rush targets down into the Klefki, still does over 50% of its damage, but you have taken the defense and special defense drops now, which this Corviknight may be able to capitalize on, and of course showing the Life Orb here. Corviknight's Brave Bird targets down into the Talonflame, so you do break those Gale Winds there.
And that's a really nice Gale Wings break there, because now if you're able to paralyze a Talonflame with a Thunder Wave, there's no way that it can get that Priority Tailwind up anymore. I like the burn into Corviknight just because it puts Corviknight on a timer. We do see that it has Roost, I believe, which makes it, it'll be able to shrug off some of that damage later on, but that means it does have to dedicate a turn to that Roost, which can be a little bit of a momentum sink, especially on a Corviknight that doesn't have any kind of setup moves. The Headlong Rush, a great defensive Terastallization from Alberto there. We saw that it would even KO through a Reflect. That is just how strong Great Tusk is. So the Klefki becoming a Ghost type means it is able to stick around one more turn, possibly the Light Screen up, possibly just in speed control, or just save itself for later in the game.
Light Screen is the move of choice this turn to help out with some of those big special attackers in the back. Talonflame's taunt into the Klefki. Klefki's probably pretty happy it got that Light Screen off before that taunt went into it here. Great Tusk's close combat into the Corviknight does do a good chunk of damage, does bring it down to under half, but this Great Tusk is now at -2 special defense and -2 defense, so you are still putting yourself at risk here. Corviknight going to be eating that Citrus Berry, is going to regain a bunch of that HP. Even though it's on a timer, it is still able to do some damage, but Tailwind instead does allow you to gain that big speed control this turn, and then, you know, maybe send in something that can help deal with that a little bit later.
I really like that turn from Toler, because if you leave Klefki on the field taunted, the only thing it can do is Dazzling Gleam, which at this point, with the -2 special defense, may be enough to knock out the Great Tusk, but your Great Tusk, it gets a bunch of damage off in Corviknight, which is great. Now you have the option to taunt it to prevent a Roost or something like that, but this Klefki is no longer as useful as you might want it to be. You know, Dazzling Gleam certainly will knock out from this range. We're probably about to see, thanks to that Tailwind boost. But, oh, matching first.
Yeah, matching Tailwinds here from that Talonflame is going to at least help with that boost. Headlong Rush from the Great Tusk into the Klefki is enough to get the knockout, so you're not going to worry about taking a Dazzling Gleam. You're now at -3, but you don't have a lot of HP left, so this may be what Toler is looking for something like a free switch later in the game.
Yeah.
Looks like Alberto's also going to get a free switch, hoping that that setup was enough with those screens.
That's a really big info there. The Klefki, it's certainly given that it's like natural stats, it could have possibly outsped the Talonflame in Tailwind, but Klefkis are typically trained only in bulk, exclusively in bulk. You don't need to be fast when you have Prankster. You don't need to invest in that special attack when your main priorities are getting up those screens and Thunder Waves. So the Talonflame outspeeding the Klefki still, despite the Gale Wings being broken, matches that Tailwind and allows Toler rather, to take out that Klefki and preserve his Great Tusk for at least one more turn.
You've got this Choice Scarf Garchomp on the field, though. This is something that would love to move pretty quickly.
Yes.
Rock Slide absolutely loves going into a Pokemon like Talonflame. Fluttermane switching in here for that Great Tusk is going to allow it to come back in later and do some more damage, possibly moving forward. However, Toler is going for a Terastallization onto that Talonflame, and that is going to be a Ghost type as well. So 2 different Ghost type Terastallizations here. You're not taking any big physical attacks, but you would be stopping that super effective damage from something like a Rock Slide, Slide, which would be doing 4 times damage here. Rock Slide connects into both. Critical hit on the Flutter Mane actually does a good chunk of damage. Taunt from the Talonflame into this Corviknight here is going to prevent it from going for things like that Roost, which it went for this turn.
That was really, really smart from Toler. I love that Ghost Terrestrialization on Talonflame because it does avoid the knockout from Garchomp. It looks like it won't even get knocked out by one more Rock Slide, which should free it up to possibly go for something like a Will-O-Wisp into that Garchomp, or just allow the Flutter Mane next to it to start firing off some attacks without fear.
Another Rock Slide here. If there's a Rock Slide, there's a flinch, and Talonflame gets it. Flutter Mane with the Dazzling Gleam this turn into the Garchomp does do a lot of damage, but that is the reason why Choice Scarf Garchomp can be so oppressive. Brave Bird from the Corviknight is enough to knock out that Flutter Mane as well. I think that critical hit on that first Rock Slide was really helpful there, especially.
That increase in damage there meant that the burned Corviknight could finish off the Flutter Mane. I imagine without that boost in damage, especially given that the Flutter Mane on Toler's team is probably trained to be very bulky like it was in Orlando, that could have been a big difference maker here for sure. Iron Bundle, though, coming in still in a pretty good spot. I believe that Toler's Tailwind went up 1 turn after Alberto's, which means that I think there's 1 turn left for Alberto's, and Toler will have that Tailwind speed advantage for at least 1 turn after. This Iron Bundle still pretty primed, though. The Corviknight and Garchomp, clearly both in range for something like a Freeze Dry, and I don't see a lot of ways that Alberto has to deal with that, especially given that the booster energy boosted its speed there.
I think, honestly, an Icy Wind might knock out both of these Pokemon. Garchomp is 4 times weak to it. Corviknight has 19 HP, you know, so at that point you could just go for that. You still know you're going to be faster because you have the Tailwind and that booster energy and speed, so that Garchomp still is not going to be able to outspeed you. Talonflame can probably just sit here and go for, you know, maybe try and go for some more damage. You won't be able to get a Tailwind up until next turn because you are on your last turn of it, but I'm assuming right now at this point that the Iron Bundle is going to be able to take that double knockout, and then you don't have to worry too much. But Garchomp says, I don't want to get knocked out yet. I'm not done. I'm going to switch out here, bring in the Roaring Moon, a Pokemon that is also is worried about taking something like a Freeze Dry or an Icy Wind. Booster Energy Photosynthesis here, though, is the attack as well, not the speed. Iron Bundle's Freeze Dry goes off into the Roaring Moon, so a really good call. Does do a good chunk, but Roaring Moon is able to handle that quite nicely. Brave Bird into the Corviknight from the Talonflame, easily enough to get that knockout. Critical hit just for style.
That's such a safe play on Toler's end, because that Brave Bird, even with the Reflect Up, it was at such low health, the Corviknight, there's no chance it could have survived that. And the Freeze Dry there, you ensure the KO on Garchomp. Maybe you thought there was a chance it could survive an Icy Wind thanks to that light screen. But Roaring Moon coming in, taking less than half from a Freeze Dry, that special defense is really strong. Unfortunately, the Iron Bundle will still have a speed advantage, and there's no protecting that Garchomp. So something like a Freeze Dry here should be able to score a knockout. The Talonflame sticking around, but that Terra Ghost a few turns ago, so it survived a Rock Slide and got the taunt off on Corviknight, turned out to be so huge. Yeah,
that Icy Wind, enough to knock out the Garchomp, does a lot of damage onto that Roaring Moon as well, does drop that speed. You can just go for either a Tailwind if you want to play it safe. You do have the opportunity to go for another Brave Bird here. This Talonflame has just kind of been the bane of Alberto's, bane for Alberto and his team. Still a lot of damage onto that Iron Bundle still with that Throat Chop, but I don't think you're going to be able to hang out for another turn here. Looks like this Freeze Dry should be able to wrap up game 1 for Toler.
Yeah, I love that we saw 2 very effective defensive terrestrializations in this game. I think when terrestrialization was first revealed, I think a lot of people jumped to, oh, I can do so much more damage, or I can get damage on a type I normally couldn't get a boost on, or something like that. And it's very clearly very effective. We've seen it on a lot of teams. But the Terra Ghost from both the Klefki and the Talonflame paid off very much for both of these trainers. Getting both of the screens up, the right light screen and the reflect, turned out to be pretty big for Alberto. We saw those freeze dries doing very little damage to even something that was super effective against that Roaring Moon. So that could be a way that Alberto has to kind of flip the second game around. But more importantly, that Terra Ghost on Talonflame paying off so much, because that turn, it terrestrialized, it taunted the Corviknight, which prevented it from roosting. And if the roost had happened, the Corviknight would have stuck around a lot longer, and that would have allowed it to kind of command more attention in that slot, whereas afterwards it was just a very, very low health burned Corviknight that could Brave Bird or Body Press and not do a whole lot of damage thanks to that burn. So it just a really heads up play from Toler.
You know what I would love to see is the Iron Bundle.
Yeah.
I think you need to try and match that speed. You are Covert Cloak, though. You are not Booster Energy like the Iron Bundle on the opposite side of the field, because your Booster Energy is on your Roaring Moon. So you're not going to be moving fast the entire, you're not going to be speed tying with it, which may be what Alberto wants, but you do have the opportunity to maybe you know, if you have a Tailwind, then you're faster at that point, which is good. Instead of, you know, instead of the 50% increase from the booster energy, but then you still have to deal with that Talonflame, and something like a Hydro Pump may be a way to do that. If you can hit it with that 80% accuracy, I think there is a world in which, as long as Alberto is able to get, you know, to take out that utilitarian Talonflame, that was a good set of words. Proud of myself there. If you are able to take out that Talonflame, then you are probably in a better position, because that was just tough. You got the Will-O-Wisp on turn 2, or turn 1 actually, because then you did the turn 2 Tailwind, you staggered it, which is a great play by Toler. But if you were able to take out that Talonflame early, I think you put yourself in a better position to move through an end game that feels a little bit more comfortable, allowing you to have the full utilization of your Corviknight. And these trainers going into game 2, I think there's going to need to be some big adjustments.
I really think that Corviknight's a big piece of this matchup for Alberto, and having it get burned so early on in that first game really limited its potential. We see that mirror, that same lead here from Toler, the Talonflame, Great Tusk, but a switch up from Alberto here, and I really like that, just because this Roaring Moon threatens a big acrobatics off the bat into that Great Tusk, and the Klefki, like, the nice thing about Klefki here is that if you do Thunder Wave the Talonflame, it will move after the Roaring Moon if it goes for a Will-O-Wisp. Obviously, Talonflame or Brave Bird, it still gets that Gull Wings boost, but the Talonflame being naturally faster than the Roaring Moon means that it does have the opportunity to Will-O-Wisp on this first turn, should it not take a Thunder Wave.
Yeah, and there's a way, you know, if you go for that Ghost Terra on the Klefki as well, you're not going to be taking super effective damage from that Great Tusk on either of the, you know, you'll still take some big damage on your Roaring Moon if you don't commit the Terrestrialization at that point, because, you know, Roaring Moon is that dark typing as well, which does, you know, it does help out a little bit if you're taking something like a close combat. But you don't, you know, not something you actually really want to do, right? But either way, still having the opportunity to go for something like an Acrobatics, Klefki is actually going to switch out here, not wanting to take some big damage, especially because it looks like Alberto committed his Terrestrialization, and by bringing this Corviknight in, if you take something like a Headlong Rush, it is not going to affect it because of that flying typing. Looks like Alberto showing that he is committed to this Terrestrialization with the flying type Terra on this Roaring Moon, getting that extra damage with the same type attack bonus now onto that Acrobatics, may be enough to get that knockout. Talonflame's Tailwind does go off first here, will allow for this Great Tusk to move next, but Headlong Rush does not connect into either of these flying types here. And this Acrobatics from the Roaring Moon, a big play on turn 1 from Alberto into the Talonflame. It's enough for that knockout. That is a huge start to game 2.
That's so big for Alberto. That Talonflame was so annoying for him in that first game. And now that the Talonflame just went straight for Tailwind, didn't try to go for something like a Will-O-Wisp to neuter the Roaring Moon. Now that you have a flying type Roaring Moon into a Great Tusk cannot do much damage to Roaring Moon at all. Obviously, Moon to those ground type attacks will resist the close combat. Fluttermane will still threaten it. Obviously, we do see the Thunderbolt on the Fluttermane, just like we saw on Justin's team earlier in the day. But I just love that play all overall. The Corviknight switch is very safe. You know, it's not going to take too much damage from Great Tusk. Even if it close combats, it won't take too much damage. And he just bought himself so much more space, because the Corviknight coming in instead of the Klefki means that Klefki can come back later, set up the screens that will last later into the end game. And that Talonflame knockout is so big, clears out so much space for Alberto here.
Yeah, and at this point too, Alberto is going to be able to stagger his Tailwind after the Talonflame's Tailwind from Toler on turn 1, and not dealing with a Will-O-Wisp on turn 1, I think was really nice for Alberto too. Looks like a Terrestrialization is going to match. It is going to be that Great Tusk with the ground type Terrestrialization. Great Tusk trying to put out that offensive pressure here. It can't go for these ground type moves onto either of these Pokemon, but the Thunderbolt from the Fluttermane with the Choice Specs into the Corviknight does a lot of damage there. Almost brings it down into the red, does eat its Citrus Berry, but if you follow this up with something like a Close Combat, you could be doing a really nice chunk of damage here. Close Combat into that Corviknight does get enough for the knockout there. Also huge, both of these trainers saying, I'm going to take out your birds very quickly.
Yeah, and depending on what happens here with the Roaring Moon, this could be a huge turn for Toler as well, because like Maeve said, that Tailwind could have staggered had the Corviknight survived those 2 attacks, but now there's no chance. Acrobatics here is going to come into one of these Pokemon, and it looks like it is that Fluttermane. Huge damage there, another knockout.
This is a way quicker game too. You know, I think at this point, just knockout after knockout, some big punches with these Terrestrialization Pokemon. Klefki is going to have to come in here and try and slow things down a little bit for Alberto, so he's not taking those knockouts, but still, Iron Bundle is a Pokemon that can do super effective damage, so a Light Screen feels pretty comfy here.
I do want to call out that ground Terrestrialization from Toler there. It's clearly not an offensive Terrestrialization on that turn, because you're not going to be using a ground type move. but had the Roaring Moon opted to Acrobatics the Great Tusk instead, most likely would have been able to survive thanks to losing that flying weakness, because there's no longer a fighting type. So it's still a smart Terastallization there. Toler probably knowing he doesn't need the Terastallization on either of his remaining 2 Pokemon, the Flutter or the Bundle. The Thunderbolt coming in handy because if Tailwind had gone up there, I would be hard-pressed to say that Toler has a way to win this game. But now that he still has a speed advantage for a couple more turns, this Great Tusk and Iron Bundle could try to combine for a lot of damage. He's got to break through those screens, though.
Either screens or now could be a Thunder Wave, right? Now could be Thunder Wave onto that Iron Bundle, try and stop some of that speed. It's got the booster energy as well, so booster energy plus Tailwind with the Thunder Wave would still bring it down to just its booster energy boost.
Yeah.
Just math is crazy, right? Light Screen, though, is the move of choice here to stop some of that special effective damage. Freeze Dry into the Roaring Moon, really showing how important that Light Screen is. Headlong Rush going to target down into that Klefki. It will be super effective damage this time. It is definitely a 1-hit knockout, no Reflect to worry about, but you can see how important that Light Screen is because it made what would have been a 2-hit knockout into a 3-hit knockout. Yeah,
it's preventing a lot of damage into that Roaring Moon. Acrobatics here will do a lot of damage to either of these targets too, and now that the Great Tusk has used Close Combat and Headlong Rush, it will be at -2 defense, so it's got to be really worried about taking anything from that. That is a 1-hit KO from the Roaring Moon into Iron Bundle.
Alberto has said, all right, you're going to leave my Roaring Moon alone. I'm going to get an Acrobatics KO every single turn of this game. It has gotten 3 knockouts. You are now facing down this Great Tusk. Alberto, knowing what his biggest offensive pressure Pokemon was, and even with this Great Tusk here, you're not going to love facing something that can do a lot of damage. Roaring Moon just going to protect this turn, allow for its partner Pokemon Garchomp to do some damage thanks to that Choice Scarf. Close Combat into the Protect as well means you are just going to be taking some big damage here possibly. And this Tailwind is probably not going to last for much longer. Dragon Claw to the Great Tusk, not enough for the knockout, but Tailwind ends this turn.
Oh man, 3 1-hit KOs from that Roaring Moon in 3 consecutive turns. That is so big for Alberto because he did struggle a little bit in that first game to get a lot of offensive pressure out, especially because he led the Corviknight Klefki, which is like the least offensive pressure you could possibly lead. Which is obviously not to say that's a bad thing, but it's such a switch in strategy from that first game we saw from Alberto, and clearly paying off. I would not have expected that Acrobatics to KO the Iron Bundle. That is massive damage.
It is absolutely massive damage, and the fact of the matter is that Alberto's adjustment was huge.
Yes.
Right? Toler was probably still going to assume that it was going to be a Terastallization into the Ghost type on Klefki, but for Alberto to make the call to go for that big offensive pressure, now Toler's on the back foot. Toler has to bring something that's going to handle that Roaring Moon better, and whether that's something like the Tyranitar is yet to be seen.
It's rough too, because if you want to bring Tyranitar, that's easily Toler's best way to handle the Roaring Moon, should it Terastallize or not. Takes that low kick and obviously Rock Slide for the flying type. But Tyranitar hates seeing Corviknight. Corviknight is a very strong answer to Tyranitar, especially because it's running Body Press. So unless that Tyranitar Terastallizes, it will be taking a lot of damage from Body Press from Corviknight and really doesn't have a way to damage it back. And so it's a really tough bring. Like we saw Justin, like I said, I feel like the Tyranitar bring in Game 2 of Justin's match earlier on was very bold, but it paid off a lot. And I think if Toler is able to use Tyranitar effectively, that could be a very, very game-swinging thing, but could also be a detriment because Tyranitar, again, rough to use into Corviknight, Garchomp as well, doesn't really like to take those Earthquakes, doesn't have anything to damage Klefki. If it Terastallizes, you have to worry about Ice moves from Iron Bundle. It's a rough bring, but it could be the key here because that Roaring Moon was so good for Alberto.
But we haven't seen Iron Bundle at all on Alberto's side, you know? So maybe if Toler makes the call of not seeing Iron Bundle, but then does Alberto make the call of I bring Iron Bundle? And that is kind of where these Game 3 adjustments get really, really dicey.
Yeah.
You don't want to overread too much, but you've seen a lot of these games where both players make the heavy reads, and then it becomes a completely different Game 3 than what we saw in Games 1 and 2. And I think at this point, right, we can see exactly how Alberto is definitely a little bit nervous on what he's picking here for his 4th and final
Rightfully
Pokemon.
So.
You know, there's a lot of things to pay attention to, and if you are bringing the Iron Bundle, then what do you leave behind? And if you aren't bringing the Iron Bundle, then what is your answer for something like that Tyranitar if that does come? Because I think that's the adjustment that Toler needs to make. And you know, Toler and Alberto are both incredibly seasoned, incredibly talented players, and they are great at making Game 3 adjustments. They've been doing it for years.
We did see Alberto opt to leave that Klefki behind in favor of the Iron Bundle, so preparing himself for a possible Tyranitar adjustment, which I think is very smart. this is also a very strong lead into a possible Tyranitar mix-up lead too. So it's a great way to kind of catch Toler off guard possibly with that Tyranitar.
Yeah, the Talonflame Great Tusk, which we've seen from Toler all 3 games. However, Alberto making his 3rd lead change of 3 games. He is going to be bringing the Garchomp and the Corviknight, but a Terrassalization Terra Ground onto this Great Tusk makes me think that maybe the Tyranitar didn't come, because that would be a Pokemon that would want to use your Terrassalization this game. Talonflame going for a Tailwind turn 1. No Will-O-Wisp to be seen this turn. Just starting with that Tailwind. Headlong Rush from the Great Tusk is going to target down into this Garchomp with that boost. It's enough for the 1-hit knockout, and already Toler is off to the lead that I think he needed really early.
Yeah, that Garchomp going down immediately is huge, because that is the only thing that is naturally outspeeding the Talonflame. Well, in Toler's eyes, the only natural thing that's naturally outspeeding that Talonflame, even though we do see that Alberto has that Iron Bundle in the back. And especially with this Tailwind going out, this primed Iron Bundle for a pretty great turn coming in. But that's a really big knockout immediately, because we saw Alberto play a little bit more of the positioning game with the Roaring Moon's partner in that second game. Obviously, the Roaring Moon stayed on the field, got all those knockouts, but we saw a little bit of positioning from that other side, and now that's no longer an option. Like, big knockout immediately.
Yeah, but this might be the time, right, where we see the Terrassalization on the Roaring Moon, goes for that Terra Flying, starts to take those knockouts again. Great Tusk is Terrassalized, so it's lost the super effective weakness to through that Acrobatics, but we saw how much damage it did to the Talonflame. Yeah, it was a 1-hit knockout.
It was, yeah. Notably, the Talonflame not Tailwinding the prior turn means that the only thing it could do this turn that would be quicker than the Roaring Moon would be a Tailwind of its own. So you can match Tailwind, but you have no chance to go for something like a Will-O-Wisp to limit damage.
Yeah, that Talonflame.
Oh, it did Tailwind.
Yes,
right.
It did Tailwind.
I'm thinking the opposite.
No, you're good. You're good. It did Tailwind. It does have the opportunity to go for something like a Will-O-Wisp this turn, which could definitely help, I think, with this Roaring Moon, because it has been such an offensive threat to these Pokemon. And there it is. Yeah, that Will-O-Wisp from this Talonflame, thanks to having its Gale Wings not be broken as of yet, means that you are able to still get that priority off and be so speedy, right? Roaring Moon with that burn, with the Acrobatics into this Talonflame. Is it enough for a 1-hit knockout? Not even close, showing how big that burn is. Great Tusk with a close combat into that Corviknight, also a ton of damage. You start taking those defense drops here, but I don't think you're too worried with the amount of damage you've got off.
Yeah, I mean, even with the Citrus Berry, that looks like it could be a 2-hit knockout through that Citrus Berry with a very, very strong close combat. That Life Orb doing a whole lot of damage. I was totally blanked on the Tailwind there. Knowing that Will-O-Wisp could come out from Talonflame changes that entirely, because now the Roaring Moon, that was such a big piece for Alberto in that second game, is no longer able to get off a bunch of damage. And we see the Corviknight already around half, possibly in range for something like another close combat. There's not a lot of damage that is being threatened on this side of the field from Alberto at this point, especially seeing the Iron Bundle come in. There is no more light screen, so those freeze dries will be firing off at full power.
Yeah, a lot of damage potential from this Iron Bundle. I mean, the fact that this Corviknight went for its own Brave Bird and had taken a bunch of damage after eating its Citrus Berry does make that close combat a 2-hit knockout.
Yes.
And that's the downside of taking that recoil damage, right? Is you know that this Great Tusk is most likely going to be able to knock out your Corviknight this turn. You can probably also take a pretty comfortable knockout on the Roaring Moon with a Freeze Dry. And then if you're Alberto, you have to focus on your final Pokemon in the back.
Yeah.
And the fact that Klefki is not here does make this endgame really, really tough.
Yeah, it's going to be tough. Like, you don't have a way of mitigating damage anymore, especially facing down a Life Orb Great Tusk that is already terrestrialized into a ground type. There's not a whole lot that wants to take any kind of damage. A big Hydro Pump coming out, though.
Big Hydro Pump, not enough to knock out the Corviknight this turn, but a close combat definitely enough to finish it off. A nice call on the Protect from that Roaring Moon by Toler. Really great to get another Pokemon knocked out here. You have one more Pokemon in the back if you're Alberto, and we saw him do this in Game 1, where he was able to bring in some final Pokemon, get those big knockouts towards the end that I think that he needed. And it's just going to be really kind of what his positioning and strategy is. Your own Iron Bundle comes in, it is not going to speed tie, it is going to be slower.
That's big, though. The Covert Cloak on Iron Bundle means that it is not going to be able to match the speed of Toler's Iron Bundle. And especially knowing that this Roaring Moon next to it, not a whole lot of damage output, Alberto was able to effectively ignore it that turn, even though it did Protect. If it got an attack off, it maybe could have gotten some chip damage into a bundle, or maybe a decent chunk to the Great Tusk thanks to those defense drops. But covering the switch option with a Hydro Pump is really smart there with Alberto.
Yeah, Freeze Dry into the Roaring Moon, not enough for the knockout here. Your Iron Bundle uses the Icy Wind, but it misses on the Great Tusk. I think it hits the Pokemon you want it to hit more and drop the speed on that Iron Bundle so that you're not too, so that you may have a better chance with that speed. Acrobatics from this Roaring Moon into the Iron Bundle, not enough to get that knockout either. That burn is really showing up big. Close combat onto the Roaring Moon is enough to get that knockout, and I think you need some big crits here at this point. Maybe some big crits on something like an Icy Wind.
That's a really big miss, though. The Icy Wind, with all the special defense drops, surely would have been able to knock out the Great Tusk. And the way that the booster energy and speed interactions work, the Iron Bundle on Toler's end actually would have been guaranteed to be slower than Alberto's once the Tailwind ran out, just thanks to how the math works out with the booster energy and the -1 speed. So that's really unfortunate because Alberto could have had an option to knock out the Iron Bundle this following turn. And then if the Icy Wind connected, maybe based on what Toler has in the back, could have had a chance to try and 1v2 the rest of this game. But now that the Great Tusk is still in the field, you basically have to commit an Icy Wind this turn in order to damage it and the Iron Bundle at the same time, or you just risk getting knocked out by a close combat.
Here's the problem, right? You can't get a freeze. Icy Wind's not going to get you a freeze. You also can't even freeze the Iron Bundle. No. Hey, there's the knockout on the Great Tusk, though. The freeze dry is going to be 100% accurate, so that's not going to be an opportunity for you to miss. You can't freeze an Ice type as well. So it's still really tough, right? You have to somehow hope that this freeze dry doesn't do enough damage to knock you out, and then you can do enough in the later game with the last two Pokemon. It's still a 2-hit knockout. So that's kind of where the difficulty comes in. I think Toler's going to have to reveal its Tyranitar. So a really interesting thing to see that coming game 3. You're going to start getting some chip damage up, though, and I think at that point that wraps this for Toler really, really nicely.
Yeah, knowing the Tyranitar was there, even if that Icy Wind had connected on the Great Tusk, I believe that Toler still could have closed this game out because Hydro Pump, we know, has a chance to miss, and even if it does connect there, like the Tyranitar holding an Assault Vest in the sand would be able to stomach that very well. But Toler finishes off Alberto's Iron Bundle with the Freeze Dry, is able to lock himself into day 2 here in Knoxville.
Another day 2 in a row for Toler. Alberto is not done yet, though. He does have to win that last match this round, or next round, and then he will also be moving on into day 2. Incredible performance by both of these trainers, especially impressive for players like Alberto.